from the book of Isaiah, mainly the suffering servant passages that are found in Isaiah. And in Isaiah, that the suffering servant that is referenced in a number of passages, he's this figure that's kind of shrouded in mystery in Isaiah, and yet when we get to the New Testament, we find out that that suffering servant spoken of in Isaiah is in fact Jesus himself. And so continuing on in this little series, we're on the second passage, the second suffering servant passage, which is Isaiah chapter 49. And so if you want to hit the pause button and read Isaiah 49, some verses to read would be Isaiah 49, 1 through 7, and then verses 12 through 16. So pause this, read that, and then come back. Just a couple of pointed questions as get into this, and those pointed questions would be for you to ask yourself: is the gospel the good news that Jesus loves you and came to die in your place, to give his life for you, and has been raised to his Father's right hand in glory? Is that making a difference in your life? Is it changing you? And then the second question would be just this: if it's not making a difference in your life, why is that? In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells us the parable of the sower, a pretty famous parable. A sower goes out and he sows seed, and it falls onto all these different types of soil. It falls on the path, and some of it falls into the rocky ground, and some falls among the thorns, and even more, some of it falls into good soil. And I'm not trying to explain that passage so much, but to say really what Jesus is getting at in that story is he's saying the seed that falls into the good soil ends up producing fruit and a crop, this huge crop. And the reason is because that seed gets deep enough into the soil. It didn't get deep enough on the path. It couldn't get deep enough on the rocky ground. It could only get to the depth of the thorns in that type of soil, and so it was choked out. The seed that got into the good soil, that got all the way down, it's what produced fruit. And so the question is, for us, has the good news of what Jesus has done for you and of God's love for you in Jesus, has that news gotten deep enough into your heart? So here in this passage in Isaiah 49, there is good news that is promised. And yet, all of a sudden, as soon as that good news is promised, we hear in this passage that the people are still in despair. And so God comes back to assure them again. In other words, they're still despairing because that good news and that promise hasn't got deep enough into their lives. And so God has to assure them again and give them ways of working that good news into their hearts so that they are changed. So here's the three things we're going to talk about from this passage just briefly, are the servant's promise, the people's despair, and the Lord's assurance. So the servant's promise, the passage promises good news of rescue and redemption and deliverance and restoration. In Isaiah's time, God's people had been taken off into captivity in Babylon, but God promised to bring Jacob back and to gather Israel again in verse 5. But the interesting thing for us to consider is that this promise, as soon as that is given to God's people, the nation of Israel, it explodes beyond that. So in verse 6, it begins to talk about a salvation to the ends of the earth. And in verse 12, it isn't just about the Israelites in captivity, but it's talking about a restoration and a gathering from the north and the west and from the land of Cyrene. And by the way, this is the longest point, so the rest of them will go faster, but we need to kind of set things up for us. So it's this promise of good news that's not bound to space and time, to a particular place or to just one particular group of people or to one particular time. This promise is for all times and for all people. You know, the servant here is shrouded in mystery, and Isaiah kind of plays that up for us. In verse 1, he talks about God had named my name, and it makes you ask the question, okay, he named your name, but what is your name? Tell us your name. And he is hidden like an arrow in the quiver in the shadows of God's hand. He's hidden, shrouded in mystery. And then it says, my servant Israel. But I can't get into all this, but he can't here be talking about the one man named Israel in Genesis. And he can't really be talking about the nation of Israel here either. It's very mysterious. What does he mean when he says Israel? And I think what's really happening here is he's saying, I'm going to come. This servant is going to come. And I'm going to come and be everything your forefather Israel was meant to be in your place. Even beyond that, he's saying, I'm going to come and I'm going to be the people you were meant to be but couldn't be. And I'm going to be that in your place. That's what I'm coming to do. Flannery O'Connor once wrote that there's something in us as storytellers and as listeners to stories that demands the redemptive act and looks for it. See, we're always looking for a hero, is what she's saying in our stories. We're looking for someone who would come and deliver us, someone who would come and be what we couldn't be, someone who would come and put himself in our place and do what we couldn't do for ourselves. And the Bible says that's exactly what this suffering servant did, because this suffering servant is Jesus, and he came to be the hero that we need and to be in our place and deliver us, and that is the promise of good news. So second, the people's despair. After this promise is given, there's an accusation in verse 14. And the accusation of the people is that God has forsaken us, that he has forgotten us. I mean, he just told them this promise, and yet they're saying, no, he's obviously forsaken us and forgotten us. And they call themselves Zion in that verse because they are identifying with that city of God that was plundered, that city of God that was ruined, that city of God that was broken and now laid desolate. And I would just say this, many of you probably feel like that right now. Like, where is God? I mean, this virus is going everywhere. Has he forgotten us? Has he forsaken us? It's almost like we say, yeah, we hear the promise, and that's great and everything. But what about right now? Where are you now? C.S. Lewis talks about this in one of his books where he talks about how in times of pain and suffering, it feels like we go to God and we knock on his door, and in that time, in our experience, we feel like all we get is silence, like the sound of a door bolting and locked from the inside, and we wonder where God is, and there's this deafening message of silence. I hear the promise, and I believe it intellectually maybe, but I don't believe it in my heart. I know the promise with my head, but it very obviously hasn't gone deep into my heart to change me, to give me hope in this moment now. So what do you do when you feel like that, when you feel forsaken and forgotten? For that, let's turn to this last point, the Lord's assurance. I'll set it up like this. Like many, when I was growing up, I know I was a rebellious teenager, and as a rebellious teenager, my parents would set boundaries for me, and at times those boundaries felt harsh, and they felt like, I remember as a kid, I know you say you love me, but it doesn't feel like you care about what I care about. It doesn't feel like you love me. And then when I graduated from high school, actually on the night that I graduated from high school, I was in an accident, not a car accident. I was at a party and I broke my neck. Actually dislocated my C3, C4 vertebrae. And what happened was I had to go into the hospital. I had to get a fusion. A piece of my hip was taken out and put in between those vertebrae and fused together. And I had to wear a halo vest. If you've seen those, you see I've got scars from that. And anyway, during that time where I couldn't do anything for myself, where I couldn't feed myself, where I couldn't dress myself, where I couldn't clean my scars, my mom did everything for me, gave up her life for me for several months to take care of me and do for me what I couldn't do. And, all of a sudden I realized how those words, "I love you," took on flesh, and I felt them and I experienced them. Words became deeds. And listen, in this passage in Isaiah, as soon as the people accuse God of forgetting them and of forsaking them, he comes right back, and you might be expecting him to say, "You idiots, of course I haven't done that," but he doesn't. He comes back, and he comes back with assurance in the form of metaphors. So he says, think about a mother nursing her child. And you can't think of a bond any closer than that. And he says, she will forget you, but I will never forget you. That's how strong my love and my bond is with you. He says, your walls are before me. The city walls are before me. He's saying, I see absolutely everything that is happening in your life. I notice everything about your life. I cannot forget you. You are always in front of my eyes. And then the final metaphor that he uses there is that your names are engraved upon the palms of his hands. And the word there for engraving, it doesn't mean like writing with ink or even like a tattoo. It's actually the Hebrew word that you would use to talk about the work of a hammer and a chisel. And it's a graphic image. He is saying, you've been chiseled into my hands. That's how much I love you. I can never forget you. And what this makes me think of, and what reminds me of, is the assurance that Jesus gave one particular person on his resurrection, doubting Thomas. He showed up, and to Thomas he held out his hands and he said, put your finger here and see my hands, the work of the hammer and the nails driven into your hands. And you know what he's saying? He is saying, my words became deeds of love. I came from heaven to earth to live in your place, to die in your place, to give my life for you. That's how much I love you. So let me just close with 3 thoughts here about how you begin working the promise and the assurance of God's love from your head into your heart. First, you got to think deeply. I don't know if you've ever tried to read poetry, but reading poetry, you can't read it through quickly. You've got to meditate on poetry to figure out what it means because of all the uses of metaphors that a poet pulls together to create a sense of something for you. And that's what God's doing here. He's giving you metaphors of a nursing mother, of your walls being before him, of your names being engraved upon the palms of his head. And he's saying, think about this. Think about it deeply. Pause and reflect and wonder at my love for you. And then rest and submit. Is the gospel making a difference in your life? And if not, why not? You know, when I said that, probably a number of you thought of activity. Is the gospel making a difference in my life? What do I have to do? Well, this is what you have to do. You have to rest in Jesus and what he has accomplished for you. And you have to submit to that. You have to trust in that and believe that and work it deep into your heart. And the last thing I would say to you is you have to see something. So verse 16 says, behold. And you know that word means look or see. And what do you need to see? You need to see the hero. You need to see this one person, the God-man, who loved you so much that he came into the world to live and die and be raised from the dead in your place. You need to look and stare deeply into the cross, because when you do, you'll be working this truth from your head down deep into your heart, and his love will begin to transform and change you.